Most people don't struggle to identify their values. Most people know what's important to them. What they struggle with is prioritizing them and working out what is most important to them in any given situation. So in this video, I'm going to share with you 3 activities that help people prioritize their values and think about what those values look like in action. Hi, I'm Kerry Price. I'm the founder of the Facilitators Network, and I use the principles of deliberate generosity to make sure that no meeting or workshop is ever wasted. I've been facilitating for 20 odd years, and in that time I've led thousands of meetings, workshops, and community conversations. Nowadays, I help other trainers and facilitators do that well. When you talk about core values, it can be confusing. Certainly in the work that I do with leaders and teams, there's 2 kinds of values that bubble up. The first are having values, things that people value having in a workplace. They value having things like flexibility, autonomy, recognition, great working relationships. That's a having value, something they value having. On the other hand, there's being values. These are things that people think are important to be. So I think it's important to be generous. I think it's important to be authentic. I think it's important to be transparent. These are being values, and these drive your behaviors and actions at work and help filter decision making. So what would be the most generous thing to do in this situation? What would be the most authentic thing to do in this situation? When I'm working with leaders and teams, I tend to focus on the being values first, and then we can talk about the having values later. So understanding the difference between those 2 things might feel confusing to start with. But in this video, I'm going to share 3 activities that look a little more closely at the being values, so it will all make sense by the end. Activity 1 is called What Does a Good Human Look Like? And I like to use this as a little bit of a warm-up activity at the beginning of a value session. It's a little bit lighthearted, but it starts to peel back the layers around what people really value in others. What characteristics do they think are important and perhaps that they aspire to? So the activity has 2 parts. The first part is I invite people to simply draw a picture of a person they admire. Now, depending on the group and the context, sometimes I leave that wide open. It can be someone they don't necessarily know personally, but someone they admire from afar. Sometimes in groups, I get really specific, and I invite them to draw a picture of someone they admire who they know personally. I let them know that it doesn't need to be gallery worthy. It's just a stick figure, something to represent that person in their mind. When I'm doing this activity, I most often draw my dad. My dad passed away a few years ago now, but he is absolutely the most generous person I know. Once I've given everyone just a couple of minutes to draw their person, I then invite them to write around the outside what are the characteristics that they admire most in that person. So when I'm drawing my dad, I would put generous, absolutely as number 1. I would put kind. I would put level-headed. I would put stable, giving. I could go on and on and on. The picture doesn't need to be tidy. It's just all about getting the internal processing on paper. Once everyone has drawn their picture and written their words, I invite people to get into pairs or small groups and just share the story of that person and the characteristics that they admire most. Once everyone's had a chance to share, then I get them popcorning into the room. Now, a lovely addition to that activity is that this can kickstart a conversation around how you want people to show up in the space as you go through the workshop. So as people are popcorning their stories and sharing the characteristics that they really admire, I'm jotting them on the whiteboard as they go. At the end of that, I might say something like, based on everything you've said, this looks like a really great list of what a good human looks like. I'm going to assume that we all want to be good humans here today. Is this list of characteristics something we can agree to work towards as we go through today's workshop? It's a nice way to form a working agreement without setting a list of rules or guidelines of how people behave. What's also cool about this activity is it kickstarts a conversation about values, because what people admire most in others is often what they think is most important that they're being for themselves. Activity number 2, being card this or that, or you might call it a being card sort. It uses these cards, which you can get off my website. The link will be in the description somewhere below. And you can do this as individuals or as a group. The individual activity looks like this. Print out a whole set of cards for every person and invite them to do a sort. What I mean by a sort is they start with one card and it might be assertive. I think it's important that I'm being assertive. They pop that down on the table and then they peel the next card. I think it's important that I'm being responsible. They then get to decide, is that more or less important than being assertive? They keep repeating the process, one card at a time, and deciding where in the list it might fit. At the end of the sort, they will have the 4 or 5 values that they value most sitting at the top of the list. That's how you can do it if you're working with individuals. If you're working with a team and you're trying to work out as a team which values do we think are most important, print out a set of cards and give everyone in the team 1 or 2 of these different values. Invite them to get into groups of 3 or 4, 4 or 5, and they sort their values in their own little groups. Then 2 groups get together and they start to resort. To begin with, it's reasonably easy, but as the groups come back bigger and bigger, it gets a little bit more complex, and you'll need to step in a little bit more to facilitate the conversation. In either case, you take a list of 35 odd values and narrow it down to the 4 or 5 that as a team they think are most important. Activity 3. This activity is called Values Last Card, and in order to do this activity, you need to have done the previous activity, the being card this or that, or the being card sort, so that everyone in the room has the values that are most important to them. How this works is you invite people to get into groups of 4 or 5 and holding the 4 or 5 values that they think are most important. You then suggest a scenario that comes up at work reasonably often, and you invite participants in the group to share which value they would lead with to work their way through that situation. So for example, I might say you've got a disgruntled customer that's come back not happy with the service that you have provided. And if someone has chosen these 5 values, they then need to decide which one of these am I going to lean into to make sure this situation goes well. Based on these random ones I've pulled out, I would say I'm going to lean into being curious, and I'm going to ask questions and find out from the customer what's really behind this complaint. Someone else might say, I'm going to lean into being future focused. I'm going to consider this situation not just as a 5-minute interaction with the customer now, but what's the difference that this interaction is going to make further down the track. This is where people get to talk about their values in action, so that it's not just words on a wall, but it's actually how they show up, how their behaviours are driven at work. These being cards are one of my favourite tools for hosting values discussions. If you'd like a set of them, head over to my website where you can download them for free. There's a whole bunch of other free resources there too. The link is in the description below. Go check it out.